Let's apply some layer effects on some of these layers. The first thing that I want to do is I want to take the layer with the flower on it and I want to make it square. Well, of course, I could go in and I could just make a selection like, well, let's see, like this. I'll take my selection tool and I'm going to hold my shift key down so that I can constrain that to be a square. There we go. And now I'll just move it into the right spot. Now, of course, there's several ways to make this work. One of the ways, of course, is just to jump this up by hitting, well, we want to put it on the right layer first. We want to put it on the layer with the flower. But then we want to just hit our Command or Control J. And you can see that what that does is it duplicates the layer and gives us our square layer right there. It just jumped up the part that we had selected onto the square layer. Now, let's not do that. Since we're working with layers here and layer effects, why don't we do this the right way, or the more efficient way? We're going to make our selection. I'll hold my shift key down to constrain that to a square. Okay, there we are. And now let's move this over, just like that. And I'm going to click on the layer mask icon here at the bottom of the layers palette. And now we have our square layer. Now I'm going to use my move tool just to move this around, get it in the spot that I want it in. That's okay right there. Okay, now let's take a look at some layer effects. Layer effects can be found right at the bottom of the layers palette. See where it says FX? Well, that's what we're looking for. And if I click on the effects, I have my choice of several effects that I want to put in. For right now, let's start with just a stroke. Now, in CS5, and I believe in CS4, the default color of the stroke is black. In some of the earlier editions of Photoshop, it was red. So if you want to make it black or want to change the color on it, you just click on the color right there, and then you can make the stroke whatever color you want. We're going to bring it down and we're going to keep it black. There we go. All right. I can also change the size of the stroke, make it a little wider. I can position it outside the image, inside the image, or in the center, partially in, partially out. Now, what you would normally do, or what I normally do, is I normally put it on the inside. That way, if I make the stroke bigger, it'll stay square on the edges. If, on the other hand, I move it to outside, you can see that I start getting rounded corners. Now, in some cases you may want that. In some cases you may not. In this case, I don't want it, so I'm going to put that on the inside, and I'm going to bring my size of that down to about 5 pixels. There. Okay. Now, if I want to add some other effects or styles to this, all I have to do is click on the style that I want to add. Right now, I want to add let's say a bevel and emboss. So I just click on bevel and emboss, put a check on there, and if I click on the words bevel and emboss, then I get to the bevel and emboss dialog box. And here I can choose the type of bevel that I want, and in this case I'm going to go with an inner bevel, and I can choose the depth or how high up this thing goes. But before I do that, I want to click on the size, and let's bring this emboss in a little bit so that we can see it. You can see it's starting to show up there. I can also put an angle of the emboss on here, showing where the light is coming from. For instance, now the lighting is coming from the lower left. Now it's coming from the upper left. And I kind of like it in the upper left. Now there's a checkbox here called Use Global Light. You want to have that checked so that all of your layers will have the light coming from the same direction. That way it makes your image a lot more believable. Okay. So now I can adjust the depth of my bevel. I just put it like that. Make it look almost like this thing has got a wrap on it. Okay, now the next thing I want to do here is I want to put a glow around the outside of this. So I'm just going to click on outer glow. Now I clicked on the word, it automatically put the checkbox in, and it gave me a yellow glow. Well, I really can't see that glow right now, so tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to click OK, and now I'm going to go to my layer, which is of the paper down here, and I'm going to add an adjustment layer to that for exposure. I'm going to make this a lot darker. So let's just go ahead and crank our exposure down like that. Don't want to make it too dark. And we can change the offset a little bit, give it a little more contrast, and then the gamma, bring that in like that. Okay, so now if I go back to my outer glow by just double clicking it, then I can modify it so that I can see it a little bit more. Let's bring the spread out a little bit so that you can see that it's coming around the outside. It looks almost like another keyline right now, but when I increase the size, then it starts getting a little bit softer. And we can bring the spread down a little bit to give it more of a glow, so that you can see now that it's actually looking like a glow. And if I have it too opaque, then I can just bring down the opacity a little bit like that. So that looks kind of nice. And we have several effects that we have on this this image right now. And these are all tied to the layer. I can turn them all off at one time if I want, or selectively turn them on and off and change them at will. Okay, now let's do something else. Let's go in, and I am going to create a new layer here. And I'm going to go to my shape tool. And I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to create a copyright watermark. The way that I do that is I pick the copyright shape, and then I just come down, making sure that I'm on the shape layer here. I'm going to hold down my Shift key to constrain this so that it won't go off kilter, and it'll be perfectly round. There we go. Now, since I'm painting with black, I've got a black copyright symbol. Now, let's move this over just a little bit. I just clicked on my move tool to move this over. Now, if I want to change the color of this, I can do it a couple of ways. One of the ways, since we are working with layers and effects, I can go into the effects menu here, and I can come up with a color overlay, and all of a sudden it turns to red. Now I can change my blend mode here. I can make it darken, multiply, screen, linear dodge, a lot of these things. But right now I'm going to keep this as normal, and I can change the opacity of the color if I want. Or I could change the color itself just by clicking in here. Now, it's not going to make too much difference what color I'm going to be using here, because I do want to make this into a watermark. Now, the way that I do that is, before I go any farther in this, if I don't want just a straight color on here, I can use a gradient overlay. Let's turn the color overlay off, and now I've got a gradient in here. And I can click here and use a lot of different gradients to color whatever it is that I want to use. Now, I can also go in and I can put a pattern on this. Let's take the gradient off, and I can go in to my patterns here and import new patterns if I want, but basically I can put a pattern on this. Well, actually, I don't want to put any of that on there right now. I'm going to take all of that off, and I'm going to leave this as black. Now, what I'm going to do here, just so that I can see it better, I'm going to remove the exposure adjustment layer. I'm just going to turn that off so that I can see my copyright symbol a little bit better. Now I'm going to go to the layer with the copyright symbol on it, and I am going to go into the effects, and I'm going to put a bevel and emboss on here. And let's see, I don't need to put a lot on here, but let's bring it up just to bring the depth up just a little bit and bring the size up just a little bit. like that. And I'm also going to put a little drop shadow on here. So I just click on drop shadow, and I can move my drop shadow away just a little bit if I want, and maybe bring the size out a little bit to soften it. There we go. And now I'm ready to make my watermark. Now, how do I make my watermark? I go right up here to the fill opacity, and I reduce my fill opacity all the way down to 0. So what happens is the color of the image itself, the color of the black in the copyright, goes away, but the layer effects stay on. And now I can go in and I can change the opacity of this to let it blend in a little bit more, so that now it really looks like it's a watermark. I can use my move tool here to take this watermark. Whoops. I can take this watermark and move the watermark up into my image if I want, or partially into the image and the background. And here, let's turn the background back on, or the darkness of the background back on. And we can see that this still shows up. So that's how you go about making a watermark using LayerFx, and how you can do a lot of things with the LayerFx.